Surprise, this is not, in fact, Zach. All right, for the sake of the recording, we're still getting started.
Anybody else want coffee? I'll take it. Yeah. I'm literally right now. Yeah, they'll see if they're out of beans. Yeah. Well, maybe next week.
Come prepared. Don't take risks on something like coffee. So I found this dangerous subscription service that has a little scale that like orders whenever I'm low. It's like
That's nice.
never out. Oh yeah, they know my habits. They know when when I'm on vacation. They know when I'm stressed at work. All right, we're just gonna kind of get started here. So what I want to do today is kind of go over some of the curriculum a little bit and kind of go further in depth just to cover it. Some may say that they've not actually done some of the pre-work. But you know, that's okay.
I would love to, but that helps. Would love
I understand. There's lots of things that I've been not having time to do recently. So, so kind of what we covered last time was, okay, so we have this new thing called React. It solves some problems for us because it takes this task of taking the stuff that we have in our code and putting it onto the screen for our users, and it kind of handles that for us. Well, the way it does that is that it, as the name implies, reacts to the data that's in your code as it's loading in the data. So what that means is that we don't tell React how to render, but we do tell React what to render. And there's special ways of doing that. That's why in the curriculum we have these things called hooks. So let's look at an example here. So this is actually straight out of the curriculum. We have two concepts we're introducing here. One is going to be, okay, so we have data. Now, how do we tell React how to render it? Or tell React what to render in the way that React wants to hear it. And also, we have handlers, right? So we've done handlers before where we say, hey, there's a button on the screen. I'm going to get a reference to that button, document.getElement by ID, right? And then I'm going to attach a handler, and then I can detach that handler or do whatever. Well, in React, it's a little bit easier. We just say, hey, there's this button reference here. We put a handler on it, and then React handles the rest as far as attaching that handler there. So you'll see two things that are true right now. So one is, I'm going to click this, okay? With the code I have now, which is just as you see, so I'm using the Code Sandbox way of loading up React here, which is how Kent does it in the curriculum. I've broken out the state object into just two variables, event count and username. That's going to be our data. Then we have our main component, which is the app component. We're going to render event count. We're going to also render username. And then this just bootstraps and actually renders our code to the root element up at the top. So that's what we got going on here. Pretty simple little React app. But what's happening right here is not exactly what we want, right? So I have click me, nothing is happening, and then I can type in this, But if you notice, input has it doesn't know where to send the values that it's getting. Similarly, we may want to attach what we typed back to the DOM. Like, so in this case, the idea is that whatever we're typing also gets rendered here. That's also not happening. So let's just start really quick with the button click, just to keep it simple. What is the first thing you would do if we wanted to increment event count every time we clicked? Just broadly speaking, not specific, just broadly speaking, what do we have to do here? What's our goal? To make like event count go up every time we click this button. So since we're in React, we don't have to do that. We don't have to do document.getElement by ID. But we do, the button right now is actually attached to nothing. So what do we need to do? Keep guessing. What was that? That's right, add an event handler. So in regular HTML, there is like an on-click event handler like this. But remember that although it's tricky, although this looks like HTML, this is actually JavaScript that we're in. So button and the handlers, there's also, like normally you would be able to document.getElement by ID, do like a add event listener. React kind of handles this for us. Each element has kind of like a set of what we call props, which will handle props. But for now, HTML elements have these basic props, and one of those are the basic HTML event handlers. So you can do on click, on press, and we're doing camel case here. That's what this is. The reason is because we're in JavaScript. JavaScript is primarily camel case. So that's why it looks like this. Similarly, I did want to point this out. In the curriculum, there's this idea of class, like a CSS class. And one of the trickiest things is that I do this all the time is class is actually a reserved JavaScript word. So we actually have to do class name as a prop. So anytime you're passing a class in React, just remember that it's class name. And there's small stuff like that you have to remember. This is JavaScript. It's not HTML or CSS. So what we can do is we can say on click here. Now, what do I want to pass to on click? So think of this as a function parameter. What am I going to pass to on click? So you're saying something like this. Okay. So let's just save that and see. So nothing's happening. That's fine. Well, let's just take a look at the console real quick. So right now, onClick is receiving a number, and it's expecting what? A function. That's right. So just like in document.getElement by ID, we want to pass functions, not just values, right? So the way to think about functions is it's like I'm taking something I want to do, but I want to do it later. So what's actually happening in this instance, the way this is written, is when it's trying to render the button, it's actually evaluating event count +1 and performing that. But if I wrap in a function, then it'll do it later, in this case, when the click event happens. Does that make sense what I just said? Okay. So I can do something really simple and just do boom. Okay. So now if I were to clear that and save it, I'm not getting that error anymore. But I do want to. Okay, cool. So right now what's happening is we've attached an event handler. It is a arrow function and it's incrementing event count. Okay, let's try it. Okay, nothing's happening. That's fine. This is so this is like the perfect example to demonstrate like, so React has a specific way that it expects data. So it's like, yeah, we need to tell React, all we need to do is tell React the data that we want it to react to, but we have to do it in a specific way. And so one way to demonstrate that is I'm going to do this. I'm going to do console.log event count. And I'm going to see kind of what's going on here. I wish I could. Let's just do this. I think I can. Okay, so it's still not, it just console logged event count the one time and it was initialized as 0, right? So that's what's going on there. I wish I could show this side by side, but I don't know how to do that in Code Sandbox, but that's fine. Now, alternatively, what I could do is so it's very common to say, okay, this is some function. Well, I'm going to actually just assign that to a variable, like a normal anonymous function, okay? And then I'll just pass the name of the function. So I don't want to do this, because what's happening when you do open close parentheses is you are invoking that function. So remember how I said functions are just a way of taking a, oh, savior. Functions are a way of taking something and wanting to do it later. Well, if I do this, then I'm doing it now. It's as if I put that event count +1 right there. So I'm just passing the name of the function such that whenever a click event comes along, it says, okay, where's that function called handle click? Oh, it's right here. Now I'm going to invoke it. And then instead of doing a console log here, so what I'll do something like this. I'll do inside component, and then if I'm not doing an implicit return, I have to break this open here, and then explicitly return this. Actually, I don't need to return anything here, because what's happening is it's actually taking this from this variable and incrementing it there. So I don't need to actually return anything there. But I can say something like this, inside click handler. And then event count. Let's see if they're the same value. Let's clear this. And then I'm going to do, so save, and then 1, 2, 3. Okay, so in both instances, what's happening is everything's still 0, okay? This is what happens when you try to use just regular old variables inside of React. So what React does is, unless you are talking to what we call the state, which I'll show you what that is, then everything treated inside of the components are actually, so they're actually they get reset as it gets re-rendered. So the idea is that like React has this special place where it keeps the relevant data that it needs to render everything, but everything else kind of gets like reset because these are just functions. So that's just a more complex way of saying we have to talk to React the way that React wants to get to be talked to for it to be able to render the thing. We can't just throw in variables and expect it to render it. So let's refactor this the way that React would want it. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to try putting this inside of the app component, because that's where you would normally see something like this. And then let's say I'm going to clear this. I'm just testing something out real quick. Okay, so same thing. It's just 0 every time because it's getting reset. So the way we save it properly is we do something like this. React has these special functions, and I'm going to make this a lot cleaner again. So this is our app code, it's just this right here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a special function called use state, and I'm going to use it like this. So I think this is how he uses this. React on that render, okay. Let's see if this may not be defined. Okay. Okay, so what's going on here is that we are using the big React object. It's very similar to like document or window. It's a global, and it's actually being imported here, which is why we have access to it. But we are using a special, what we call a hook. Okay, so hooks are the places that we talk to React's internal data. And in this case, what we want to do is we want to change event count and username, and also how we're changing event count and username to use React hooks. So underneath under the hood, React's going to then do everything it needs to do to say, oh, this data has changed. Now I'm going to re-render. Okay. So instead of event count equals 0, what we're going to do is this. We're going to comment that out. The same way that you would kind of do this would be to say this. I'm going to initialize a piece of state. I'm going to initialize it as 0. And then I can assign 2 things in this little array here. First is going to be the variable name that I want to work with. And the second is going to be a function, and that function is going to be very similar to my variable name, and it will change it for me. I'll show you what I mean. So we still want event count, so that's going to be the other thing. And then it's always 2. It's always just 2 that come out of this array. Event count, and then set event count. Okay? Similarly, I'm going to do username. So what is this going to be? Set username. I'm going to do that. Okay. And what type do I want username to be? A string. So then what am I going to do here? I can initialize it to whatever I want it to. It could be foo if I wanted it to be. But for now, I'm just going to keep it like this. Just an empty string, okay? So I'm a big single. It doesn't matter because it's JavaScript. But whenever I hit Command S, it changes it. I guess that's just what this this particular like Code Sandbox, I guess, wants that. I'm sure you could change that config, but like at work, when I hit Command S, our config changes it to single quotes. So okay, cool. So now we're going to try it. Let's see. Okay. So I'm getting it out of state. I'm getting event count out of state. I'm rendering it here. But whenever I click it, it's still not doing anything. Can you take a guess as to what I may need to do with this new the new stuff that I did, the new refactor that I did. Take a guess. Wild guess. Guesses are good. What am I not using so far? I am using handle click. What about this that am I not using now? That's exactly right. So what this set function does is whatever value I send to it, that's what this ends up becoming. So I know it's kind of weird to think about that, but the idea here is that the values that we change have to go through use state. So you have to send it into use state, and then it comes back out of use state, and then that's what gets rendered. So if I'm wanting to increment every time, what do I need to pass to set event count? That's exactly right. Okay, let's try this. Woo! So really what's happening underneath the hood is before we use set event count, we are actually changing the value of event count. The problem is what gets passed to React to render is nothing. There's no reference. React has no reference to what it wants to render. So in this case, what we're doing is we're saying, okay, so I have this value, and then I want to the rendering to react to what we're sending to React. In this case, it's a piece of data, and that is what we call state. The state of an application is what, at least in the React world, is the data that we want React to react to as it changes. Okay, and in order to do that, we have to use state. Okay, cool. Okay, so then right here, I'm typing in here and nothing's happening. Given what we know now, walk me through how we make you typed this value show up. What's the first thing we need to do? What's the first thing we do with the button? Boom. What do you want to call it? Quick, we don't got all day. I probably would just do this. That just comes with experience, like naming stuff. So, okay, so then what do we need to do here? Okay, what are we going to send it to? This gets handled in the curriculum, actually. So do you remember what we do if we had an event handler, if we do document.get element by ID? Yes, you're on the right track. So the injecting in the HTML, yes. So, but okay, so in this, all we're doing is we're taking an existing number and incrementing it. Like we have all the information we need in order to set that value. This, we need to know what's actually in the input. Okay, so if you remember, there's always this little event, and this is don't get caught up on, I guess, the naming, because you can name event count to just count or whatever. But there's always, with events that come from the DOM, there's always that little event object, and then we can do something like event.target.value. So event tells us the type of event. It's information that's coming from the browser, essentially. It could be named anything you want, but the properties are always going to be the same. So remember, like with an object, any object, you can create an object and that variable be anything you want. But then everything that you define in the object you have to reference it the same way. Similarly, that can be anything you want because it's just a reference to an object, but the properties are target and like type and all this other stuff to tell you more information about that event. And then in this case, target. So the target, if you remember, refers to where the event came from. In this case, it was this input. And then in the case of an input, it always has a value, which is what is being input here from the DOM. Okay. Okay, so fantastic. So now we're going to type this. So it's still not changing anything there. So let's actually do something here. I just want to see what's going on. So I'm going to clear this out and then type in here and oh, thank you so much. I appreciate that. I want to be wired up. Okay, so I created the handler, but then I didn't actually attach it. See, so that's why we're not seeing anything. So this would be if you want to know more, well, I'll just do it here. So event handlers React. This is something that is inside of the docs. It's also linked in our curriculum, but there's a lot of really, really great information here. So like notice this, they kind of go into what I was talking about earlier, that this is JavaScript, not HTML. So it's slightly different. But then we can like look for an input here. So let's just Google it, input handler React. Okay, so this is essentially what's going on here. We don't need an on click, and there's different handlers. There's like on key down, on key up. There's a bunch of handlers for you to be able to do lots of cool things. But really, all we want is this handle change, or on change rather. Sorry. So let's go back to this. So we're going to do on change equals, and then what am I going to pass here? What did I do on the button? Right, so I just want to pass the function name that's going to actually handle it for me, okay? So we're going to save this, and I'm going to type here. I can see that there's some events happening. Okay, so cool. It's changing. Good. Now, I can change this back to set username. And then I can type here and look at that. As I change it, it is putting it there. Something that you'll see very often, and I do want to point out, is that right now, there's this concept, and you don't really need to know this like super in depth, but it is something you need to watch out for. And so I do want to point this out because it is in the docs, okay? There's two types of inputs in React. There's controlled and uncontrolled. So right now, this input is what we call uncontrolled. And the reason is because we're not explicitly telling it the value that it should have. In other words, it's just taking it from its defaults in the DOM. But let's say that I wanted to give it a default, not a placeholder attribute, but like an actual default value. Or I wanted to, let's say, so imagine that you are creating a form that uses a Google autocomplete. So someone starts typing in their address, and then they select it, and then you have these other forms that you want to fill in with a value based on the state. Well, the way you would do that is you would actually do what this is saying to do, which is you give it a value attribute. Okay, so in other words, you're explicitly giving it a value, which means you're now making it a controlled input. Okay, let's see what happens whenever we do that. So what I want is I want the value of this to also be username. Okay. So now what's happening is, well, let's go back to without a value. Okay. So then what happens is if I give this a value and I say foo, look what happens. Username has a value. But if my goal is to just completely sync up what is in the input versus what is being shown in UTyped, then they're out of sync now. That's because they're uncontrolled. And then whenever I start typing, it resets because it's setting exactly what I typed to the value of username in this case. So what I want to do now is I want to give this a value. I want the value to be username. And then now they're synced up. So now it's controlled. My general advice is I think there's lots of different ways of doing it. And there's actually many different libraries out there that help you build forms, complex forms in React that do it different ways. I personally use controlled values most of the time. So I always make sure that anything that has that needs a value, I'm giving it a value attribute. So then same thing happens whenever I do this username. Okay. So interestingly enough, though, you will run into this bug. If I were to give it a value, but give it something other than username, let's just say in this case, empty string. What happens is the value will always be that value. It's a static value. So every time I hit A, what it's saying is, okay, what is username? Well, now I'm going to give that to the username variable, but nothing ever happens to the input itself. So whenever you're in React and you hit this bug where you're typing something and you can't see anything, it almost always has to do with the fact that the value itself is being controlled, but two, it's static and not changing. So we just have to make sure that every time we do set a value attribute, that we're doing something that is being changed, in this case, username. And how are we changing it? From use state. Okay. So notice, so the rule of thumb here is this: always give it a value, always give it a handler, and make sure that the value and the handler end up being the same. So I'm looking at this username, I'm using it the handler, set username. Okay, good. We're probably good. If they're two different pieces of state, or if they're state values that don't change, then we'll probably run into a bug. But rule of thumb, username, I'm doing set username. Okay, I'm probably good. And then if I set this, I do get a foo, but then I get to change this here. My username is Devo, whatever. Okay. And then this still should be working. Any questions? What questions do you have, I should say? Is anyone talking in Slack? Are we good? I just want to make sure I wasn't. That's great. Yeah. I mean, for what it's worth, I was working with this stuff just the other day, like some form stuff. It's very common, and you can build something interesting pretty quickly with forms and user input and stuff like that. Okay, cool. So what we've done is we've now made this fairly basic where it wasn't doing anything and not connected to where now we're connecting it to React and able to let React see what the changes that we want to be able to tell it.
This function right there, like, are you always gonna have two values? And you said that React state,
That's right.
okay. We're gonna pass.
Yeah, this is what we call a pattern, meaning it is the idea of doing a use some function. That's a pattern in React. That's like hooks. That's a pattern. And then this, like the use state hook, will always return these two values. These could be whatever we want, but in order to stick with convention, which makes our code readable, it makes it to where we have to burn less mental calories to write new code. All of that, like that helps us kind of keep track of that. So yeah, like and in like at work, some of the big forums have like 25 use state, like a bunch of these because they're keeping track of different state. But what's good about it is that like instead of being in this big data object, they're kind of all decoupled from one another. Okay, so like it's a pattern that allows us more flexibility. Especially if you were to look at this is not something we teach, but you creating components as functions is the newest and best way to write React. But there used to be a way to write them with classes. That's actually, if you look at the docs, you'll see a lot of class-based. This is what a class component looks like. This is honestly messier. There's a lot more boilerplate code, meaning there's a lot more just out-of-the-box code to get it to work, etc. And also all the state is usually in like this big data object. With hooks, it's a little bit just cleaner. And like I said, they're independent of one another. So you can not worry about like breaking things as easily, like if I were to take one out or whatever. So, but to answer your question, yes, these can be whatever they want, but in general, it's good to find conventions in programming because, and like a library like React often has conventions because it takes, like, as a programmer, you want to be able to focus on solving the problem. You don't want to have to worry about the mental calories of every technical decision along the way. Exactly. Yeah, it standardizes across a team, which is very, very important, especially in bigger companies. Even small teams, really. Like, I think that yes, I've called myself an idiot multiple times. Like, who the heck wrote this? Yeah, that was me. Okay, so if you look at the hooks documentation, there's actually a whole bunch of them. So hooks API reference, there's the basic hooks, these three, there's additional hooks, there's a bunch of them. What we're probably going to teach is probably just these two, which will get you like 90% of use cases. Is use state, which we've already used, and use effect. And then use context we may be able to get into a little bit later. But use context is kind of a lot like use state. It just helps you with larger programs where you need to pass that state to many different components. For now, we just have to worry about use state because, again, you can get away with 90% of your use cases with these two. So, okay, so let's say we wanted to I wonder if you can change the title here. I'm going to try something. No. That's nothing. Okay. There was an example that I wanted to use. There's two examples I wanted to use, but I don't think that they'll be good in this particular example. Let's do. Let's do this. Okay, so you all right over there? Okay. So whenever I refresh this, no, that's not what I do. I think I like this being on bottom. Where are you seeing that? Backward compatible. So backwards compatibility refers to like if you create a new version of a piece of software, you also want it to work with older versions. So what I think what they're saying is like there's a bunch of apps out there that are built in React. And then like, so for instance, the change from class-based components to functional components or the use of hooks, they could have easily said, well, now you have to rewrite everything in classes. Well, what that does is there's going to be a bunch of companies out there that are scrambling to rewrite, and there's going to break a bunch of code as soon as you upgrade. So they made it backwards compatible in the sense that you can upgrade, do all the new stuff, but also old stuff will work too. Yep. Okay, so one thing I want to point out is okay, so whenever I am clicking this, you'll notice, okay, so cool, we have it's incrementing and it's incrementing event count. And then what happens, so in Code Sandbox, what's happening is whenever I save, it also refreshes the application and it resets it to 0. Okay. Well, let's say that we wanted to remember the last number that it was. And then maybe we even have another button that will help us reset it. So in other words, the state of the application is such that no matter what, refresh or not, we know what the last event count was, and also we give an explicit reset. So like the user, if they want to reset it, they can. So the first thing I'm going to do is do something like this, and this is going to be reset. I'm going to change this to say increment. And then I'm going to need a new handler. Let's see if okay. So I just needed a function there. So in this handler, if I'm doing a reset, what should I do? What am I doing in my other handler? think. How do I tell React what the value of event count should be? Take a guess, somebody. I would. And what do I want to set it if I'm resetting it? Something like that. So I'm initializing a 0, I'm incrementing, and then whenever I want to reset it, it'll reset to 0. Okay. But again, what happens still is whenever I hit save or I refresh the page, it clears it. Okay. So there's a way, and this is a common API to use for stuff like this, but there's a way to save small pieces of data that are not like cookies or something that tracks the user. You got to think of regulations, but in this case, we're going to use an API that will allow us to essentially, like, assuming that the user doesn't clear their cache, that they'll come back to our page and have the same value that they had previously. It's not a cookie. It's actually called local storage. So I'm gonna Google React local storage. Actually, I don't use this API a ton, so I'm just gonna see. So LogRocket blogs are really good, by the way, if you ever see them. This is talking about a third party library. Offline access using local storage. So once a web application like a React app or any HTML application, once it's loaded in your client, it doesn't really care if it has connectivity until it tries to send a request back out, like a fetch or a post or something like that. However, there are ways to kind of like write code that would allow it to just like detect, like, let's say that you have an app that needs to kind of say persist data, and it's for users that do have spotty connectivity, like people out on an oil rig or something like that, right? There are web APIs and stuff in the browser that you can use to like help you do that. And you could have like certain apps that would like use local storage to kind of like for stuff for the UI, to where it doesn't have to have connectivity to change the UI. But almost inevitably, you're going to need to both update the UI for the user, but also send that data back somewhere else. So what I would say is, the answer to your question is yes, but technically yes. Yeah. And for what it's worth, that's actually where React shines, is this idea that like, there's actually a really, really good talk that they gave about Facebook. It was actually Facebook engineers who gave about Facebook. And the idea is, think of all the things that are going on in Facebook at one given time. You have, X person logs on, Y person logs off, X person logs on again. You have all these events that are coming in that this application needs to know about in order to change the UI. And then you have stuff that the user is doing that then it has to send out. And the idea is like, you're updating the UI all the time, and then also having to persist that back to the server, because, for instance, your friends are going offline and online, and also Facebook's tracking whether you're online or offline, right? So if you're looking at Facebook, unless you have it changed to a different setting, it's going to tell your friends that you're online. So there's like all this back and forth. And the point is React really shines because all you have to worry about is like making sure that the data looks right at any given time. And then the UI, and then anything that gets triggered off the UI, say like a fetch call or something like that, an API call of some sort, that all happens kind of, I'm not going to say seamlessly, but it's like, the code is really clean on how you actually like make that happen. So, but what you're getting at is that that front end development can be challenging for those two reasons. You have to worry about what your user is seeing and also make sure that the data is correct, that there's no data anomalies, that you're not overriding data, changing data, showing bad data or outdated data. I mean, I've worked in healthcare tech before, and that's like something we always had to be very, very, very cognizant of, because you show the wrong value, like a lab value or something like that, and you're actually in patient safety territory. Social media is not patient safety critical, but you might be costing a company a lot of money if you're showing the wrong data. Yeah, that's exactly right. That's a good example. Fuel prices and stuff like that. Yeah, because you can make customers really angry. Okay, so what I'm wanting to do is I'm wanting to find a way to use local storage to save the value. And I think what I'll just do is I'll just look up local storage, just JavaScript, because React is just JavaScript. So a lot of stuff that I need to do, I can just do as if it were just JavaScript. So, okay, this is exactly what I was looking for. Okay. So local storage is this API. I have access to it globally. So it's another one of those special global things. And then I can set an item and get an item. And what it's doing is it's saving it locally such that when I refresh, I should still be able to find the value that it last was if I'm setting it correctly. Now, the way that we're going to do that, well, actually, first let's test that part out. Okay. Actually, no. I want to demonstrate the second most important hook in React this way. And there's a reason for it. So if you remember, the two most important ones are use state and use effect. Those are the ones that we're going to actually going to cover. And use effect is essentially this. It runs a piece of code. I don't really like their examples. They're worth looking at after I introduce you to them. But we'll just do it this way. Okay, so the idea of a React functional component is that it's what we call a pure function, meaning it's not taking data outside of itself and manipulating it. It's doing a one unidirectional thing. And the only thing in our case that is not that way, or the only thing outside of that is React stuff. Okay, so again, what do I mean? So remember when we had just the variables event count and username? Well, they weren't doing anything. And what was happening, and the reason that they're not doing anything is because what React does is just calls that function, it evaluates that code, and then it's done. With useState, we're telling React, okay, hey, keep track of this. And also keep track of it in the DOM, sorry, in the renderer if I'm specifying it to render, like in this case. Well, effects are like things that we don't care about as far as render necessarily, but it's a function that we want to run sometimes based on something else that happens. That's why we call it an effect. It's a side effect. That's the reason it's called use effect, is because it's a side effect. So the way we use use effect is we have the use effect function, and we call it. Effect takes another function. It's always an anonymous function, pretty much. So we're going to open close like that. And then we want to specify the code that we want to run as a side effect. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually just going to say, here's what event count says. Okay. And I'm going to get rid of foo here. I saved it. Okay, so in use effect, all I'm doing is console logging what that is. Now, let's see if that's the same. Okay, it is the same. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say something like this. When the value of event count changes, I am going to use the local storage and I'm going to set that local storage value to whatever event count is. So this is a side effect. Why? Because my main app code is concerned with the value of event count because I want to render event count and I want to make sure React keeps track of event count. Right? But my side effect is that I want to also store it in local storage. So I'm going to use the local storage here. And I'm going to say, I'm going to set item. So if I look back at this, it's set item. My key is arbitrary. I can set it to whatever I want. And then I'm going to say like stored count. And then I'm going to do event count here. So also what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, let's just, for funsies, I'm going to say console.log, and I want to see that what I'm getting out of here is that. So I'm going to clear console so that I know that I'm only seeing what I want to see here. I think that this is out of sync by 1. Sorry, I'm doing some debugging here. Inside effect. And then outside effect. So outside effect gets 0, inside 1, outside 1, inside 2. Okay, I see what's going on. Okay, so now what I want to do is, okay, so what was my goal again? I'm incrementing that. I hit save, it still goes back to 0. So now what if we were to do something like is going to be, let's say, local storage dot get item stored count. I think get item will be undefined if it doesn't find anything. We can test this. So if I were to go to here, I don't. So local storage dot get item, and let's just do blah, blah, blah. It comes back as null, okay? So then what I want to do is I don't want event count to be null, I want it to be 0. So if it comes back as null, I can do something like this. So this is another way of saying if this is falsy, 0, false, empty string, all that, then I want to set it to 0. Let's see if this works. Still back to 0. It might not be doing local storage here. Okay, so I think I actually know what I'm doing wrong. Let me double check real quick. This is a key part of useEffect, and it's actually something, frankly, I struggle with sometimes. Let me just try something. So useEffect actually takes a second parameter. I'll explain what I'm doing here in just a second. Oh, I'm a dummy. Did y'all see what I was doing? I was wondering why. Oh yeah, I definitely say that to myself a lot. I'm debugging my own code and I'm like, I am an idiot. It's not good. Positive self-talk is a good thing. You should always have positive self-talk, except when you're being an idiot. Oh yeah. Yeah. So the idea was to take the local storage at the beginning of, like, whenever it first loads the component, and put that into the use state and make event count. Did y'all see what I did though that I was doing wrong? What is, okay, remember when you initialize a use state, where does that go? Yeah. So what should this be if I want to initialize it from local storage? Should probably be this, right? Okay, so now I got a different bug. And there's a reason for this, and I want to see, okay, so this is great. I love this. So what I did is, let me back out. Let me just back out here a couple times here. So my first problem is that useEffect runs, you can tell useEffect when to run. It can run every time it re-renders. It can run once when the component first loads, or it can load based on any state change that I want to define. Okay. In this case, all I care about is when event count changes. So the way I tell useEffect that is there's an array. The second parameter to useEffect is an array. So the first one is just this function here. Okay. The second one is this array. And then in the array, I have a comma separated list of all of the things that I want to, that if those variables were to change, then use effect should run. Okay. In my case, all I care about is event count. Okay. Now, I know that your eyes are glazing over already because use effect is tricky and it can be kind of weird to understand. But what I want you to come away with today as your first introduction to use effect is that it's a side effect, meaning it's something I want to run. It's not my primary concern. It's like, hey, I want this to happen, but it's not a part of my primary concern. And the way I tell it to run is based on other state. Okay, so state's my primary. It's my main thing I'm worried about. So if anything is my main thing, in this case, event count and my event handlers and all that, not my event handlers themselves, but the idea being my event handlers, all they're doing is changing the value of the state. And then what I'm rendering is just coming from also state. So state is your primary thing that you're worried about. Anything secondary to that that reacts to the state is use effect. Okay. And that's why I'm saying, hey, when event count changes, run this and set my local storage. All right. So that's the first thing I did. The second thing I did is I changed the initialization of use state to be this value. So initial count, whenever it gets saved, I can tell you for a fact that it is now using initial count in this example with the ones. But so instead of doing a 0, I do want to initialize it as 0 if I don't have anything already stored. So that's what this line does here. Okay. What I'm saying is grab the stored count key, whatever that value is. If there's nothing, give me 0. Okay. So that's what initial count is. So instead of passing 0 for my event count initialization, I'm going to pass the initial count variable. All right. Cool. So I have some code. And after we're done with class, review this code, come up with some questions. Like, don't expect you to get everything all at once. This is your first introduction to it. Like all things, go through it once, go through it again, go through it again. Eventually you'll have some synapses fire and click and boom, you'll be fine. But what's happening here is I'm resetting it to 0, I'm incrementing, that's fine, but then I'm going to save, and then I'm going to increment again and it adds ones. Okay. Let's step through that again. Okay. What happens whenever I hit the reset button? And I want you to remember this key thing. React is just JavaScript. This is just JavaScript. So think back to your JavaScript, intro to JavaScript module. We have to remember our fundamentals in order to build off them. So what happens when I hit the reset button? Sets it to 0. Okay. It does. Every time set event count is called, this is going to be called. Why? Because this value ends up changing because of set event count. Yeah, it is. And frankly, this is how programming can be sometimes. So your goal, like oftentimes your goal as a developer is to like take the thing that you know you can understand and like make it understandable. And that's why we have things like React, which help us take all that rendering logic outside of the problem we're trying to solve. And it is still complex, but like it could be a whole lot worse. You know what I mean? So that's why like frameworks like React, things like Node.js, or even like Ruby on Rails or Django or anything in other languages that help you build stuff, it's because it's taking away something that is complicated and putting in its own concern, and then we can worry about the problem at hand. So to answer your question, yes, what's happening is that it is changing. Okay. But the only time that we get that value is whenever we hit the save button or we refresh. The same thing's happening. Okay. Okay, so I've hit reset, it's 0. Now what happens whenever I hit increment? What's happening? I'm doing event count plus 1. Okay. Right? So now what's going to happen is I'm going to test my code, because what I want to happen is I want it to come back and be 5, right? So I'm going to hit save. It's going to refresh. Okay. We're at 5. It didn't reset to 0, which is good. Okay, so we're good to go so far. Okay. But I'm going to hit increment, and it's going to add 1 to it every time I click it. What is happening? Exactly. So what type is 0 when I hit reset? It's just a number, right? What happens when I hit increment? I'm adding, and it's interpreting it as a number. Okay. So what happens when I hit save? It's coming back into use state. And then event count is what? Why do you think? Well, what happens whenever I hit save? Like, let's step through the code. What happens? What's the first thing that happens whenever I hit save and it resets?
It's pulling it, so it's pulling the value, it's looking to see, is it null or not? It's not, so it's pulling the initial count. But why is
From where?
uh,
From local storage.
right, but where does, I mean,
So
local storage, are you having to define local storage as a type of number? Or like, I mean, is it defaulting to some sort of a
probably, how would we test that? Basic JavaScript days.
by the type,
Right. So let's do this. Let's do a little bit of this right here. Type of initial count. And then let's reset and hit save. So let's clear, this is old console. So increment.
So is that because if you do not define a type, that it will just create it by default string? Just default.
So it looks like every time this is coming back as a string.
Because I would think that it would, if you're setting it as the value of the event count, I would think.
Yeah. So it's what's really happening here is not a React thing. What's happening is more has to do with this right here. So when we had this just as 0, 0 is a number, React knows it's a number, okay? This is actually an ambiguous statement as far as types are concerned. The reason is because 0 is a number, and this is only returning a string. In fact, so local storage get item. When passed a key name, will return that key's value or null if the key does not exist. The key name return value, a string containing the value of the key.
Where you're setting it.
That's a good thought. So you're saying to make sure that it's saving as a number. That is probably that's a good thought. What I would probably say is that we probably don't have power over that, because this is a browser level. Like, get item is just going to be a string always. So instead of changing it to a number when we set it, what should we do? Yep. And this is how we would do that. I think. I don't know. There's lots of ways to convert types in JavaScript, but this is one way to do it for sure. And then we'll save it. And then so it's coming back and then it's working now. Well, let's get rid of it and I'll show you. What's that say?
Okay.
Exactly.
Okay.
And that is because of this. So again, my point is that like, so I think it's a good thought, like, okay, let's make sure that we're keeping it the right type whenever we save it. Fantastic. The problem is that we don't have control over the type that it returns. And according to the docs, so as a developer, all I have to go off is the docs of other people's code. I can't change what get item does, but I can go off the docs, and from the docs it says a string. Okay, so a good point would be, so like let's say that we were saving and retrieving an object instead of just a value. So you'll see this type of code. In order to save it, you'll have to JSON stringify or JSON parse out, because it's always going to be a string. My guess is that if you call set item on an object, it's going to JSON stringify it under the hood anyways, and we don't have to worry about doing that explicitly. But to get the right value type out, we have to parse the string, because it's always going to be a string no matter what. So this is actually something that's really, really common as far as like working with forms and stuff like that from the document. Everything in the document is going to be a string, pretty much. There are times where you can tell it like an input be explicitly a number, let's say. But overwhelmingly, you can assume that if it's something coming in from like event.target, or if it's coming in from local storage, or if it's coming in from something in the browser, it's probably going to be a string. And if you remember, you can go back to my recording, because I know that I said this, but whenever we started JavaScript 2, we talked a lot about types, and that's because you always have to be cognizant of what types stuff are. Otherwise, you get bugs. So to be explicit about what the bug was doing, what this was doing is when event count was a string, what happens whenever you do a plus to a string? It concatenates it, right? So it was adding the string 1, as if I were adding a space, right? So that's why that was like that. And that's the type of bug that you would see. I mean, in my brain, just like as an experienced developer, I knew exactly what was happening whenever I saw that, because like, oh, it's probably a string. And JavaScript's trying to be smart. JavaScript's trying to be smart and saying, oh, you want me to just add this because it's a string, because this is the value that comes first. So the thing about making a dumb thing smart is that it only can be so smart. And computers are dumb, which is why we have to write really, really, really clear, explicit code to tell it what to do. Cool. Any questions? Anything else you want to talk about? I thought this was pretty productive, and we got through most of the stuff that I wanted, or pretty much all the stuff that I wanted to get through. The one thing I will say is that useEffect does something different if I were to do no value here, or if I were to do an empty array here. So there's 3 possible values for useEffect: nothing, empty array, or let me be explicit and say, this is the thing that I want you to look at and run this effect when this changes. What I recommend is looking up some examples of useEffect, looking at the examples in the curriculum of how Kent uses useEffect, and just kind of getting a feel for it. useEffect is really hard, but unfortunately it's really, really common. So, but what I want to point out is this: getting data and also persisting data is a very, very common use case for UseEffect. So what am I doing with local storage? I'm persisting a value to a data store somewhere. Normally, we do that through API calls. In this case, we're using local storage because it's lightweight and it's a small value. But the idea is that, I mean, it's just like whenever you're first learning about computers, right? You have RAM and you have your hard drive. Like you have stuff that if the computer turns off, it's gone. Then you have stuff that's there even whenever you reboot or whatever, okay? Similarly, we have everything in our code is there until it refreshes. And the only way that we persist that data is to get it from an API, to get it from local storage, to get it from a file, something that is persistent storage. So what you'll find is that there are a lot of use cases for UseEffect, but what we're primarily going to try and teach you is just to use UseEffect as a way to say, okay, hey, now I want to get data, or hey, now I want to save this data. And there's different ways of doing that, but that's pretty much the main way you can think of using UseEffect. Is the side effect is, okay, I got everything good in my UI, now I want to save data or I want to get data. Okay. I know that's probably going to be confusing, but like, again, like just try to absorb it, go back through this, and it'll start to click a little bit. So the good news is that with these tools right here, this is pretty much like 90% of React. Like, absolutely. This is actually something that we'll end up doing. So remember how I said that UseEffect, so I can have multiple UseEffects, and I should have multiple UseEffects because oftentimes I want them to run independently of one another depending on different conditions, okay? Remember how I said that you can have nothing, empty array, or something in here? Well, if you haven't, I always forget this actually. So UseEffect, this is called a dependency array. Actually, I'll go ahead and I'll link this so that we know. Okay, so this is an example of like what I was using, right? So what's happening is that this is console logging. It's only console logging whenever counter is being changed in this case, okay? In this case, I may have multiple things, like 2 counters that I want to log, okay? Empty means that the dependency array when the hook triggers, so what happens, it simply means that the hook will only trigger once when the component is first rendered. So I don't personally think that this makes a whole lot of intuitive sense, but this is how they designed it. If you want it to render only one time, or you want this to be run only one time, you do it whenever you define it by it doing an empty array, okay? So similarly, you could do something like this. This is exactly what I was going to show you was when my component mounts, I want to then fetch data from an API, okay? The reason that that should be written that way is because as a good developer, I'm always wanting to make a great experience for my user first. The way I do that is I don't let my sort of render time, my time to painting something onto the page for my user, to be delayed by anything. So what we do is we say, okay, mount the component. Then I run this effect after that, which initiates the API call. Instead of saying, okay, I'm mounting, now go do an API call. I don't know when that API call is coming back. I might have lost connectivity. I might have broken my app. So what I want to do instead is I want to say, paint something on the picture, then do an API call. It could be something simple. It could be a loader. Something that we see really often nowadays are skeletons. So you know how when you're trying to load a page and it's just like gray kind of blobs and it like kind of looks like it's loading. That's all UI tricks to make you think that something's happening. but it works. I mean, it's psychologically it works. There's a lot of research behind it, but like the idea is that I want to put something on the screen, make my user think that it's working, so that they don't give up on my app. And then in the background, I'm getting data from an API or whatever. Okay. So there's another example of, I think it's probably in here, but the idea, the third option is if I want it to run every time that it re-renders, no matter what. So every time state is changing, every time set username is called, every time set event count is called, with no dependency array, this would get run every time. So if I were to console log here and then start typing in here or hit increment, I would see it. Oops. So why is it saying got here whenever it changes? Well, that's because a re-render is triggered every time set state is called. And with set username, I'm calling it every time I hit a key. So that's probably not what I want. I don't want to fetch data or change everything every single time set state is called, but I may want to do it once whenever it is first loaded. And then I can do something like a fetch call in here. Okay. And when that fetch call is done, then I can like do another use state and set that state. So this is really, really common pattern right here. So when I'm first loaded, do a fetch call, and then I'm going to take that data and put it into a set state of some sort. And then that will in turn render it. We're at time, but the way that I might do that is you can actually do something called conditional rendering. So like, let's say that I have a spinner component. So like really fast, I could do something like and let's say that by default, we're going to say true. So something in React you can do, because this is just JavaScript, I can return if is loading set spinner else return what I want. And let's say this is all data from my API fetch. So then in my call here, I'll do a set. So I can do it like a dot then. And then inside that, do something like set is loading to false, because I'm done. So what's going to happen there is I'm going to say, okay, my component mounts, it starts my API call, but I'm in an is loading state. So I'm going to do a spinner or a skeleton or something UX wise that like tells my user, hey, I'm working here. Then whenever this is done, I'll set it to false. And then because this is false, I'll render my actual data here. So that's like the one thing that we didn't have time to get to today, but like I'll go ahead and upload like this and just kind of as an example of this is a real world way that you would use effect in order to you know. Oh yeah. So this is a one-page application, but because these are components, you can have a bunch of components doing all sorts of stuff at the same time. And using use effect well is how you would manage all that across the components. So this will break because this is there is no spinner component to use, but yeah, cool. All right, well, if that is all, I can stick around for a second on the Meet. So feel free, anyone on the Google Meet, to hit us up. But otherwise, I'll stop the recording, and y'all have a great weekend.